Well, the first thing I just wanted to start off with is when I decided to email you, which was purely random. I was at a coffee shop, and I heard that you had a kind of strange habit of responding to email.
I do, very strange.
So I actually did it as a writing exercise, in a way. I wasn't, thinking that you were actually going to write back. And the question was whether or not Brave New World or Orwell's 1984, which one of those was either a better book to teach or a better kind of prophecy or prediction of where we were.
Guess what I might have, did I mention Zamyatin?
Exactly.
Yeah, because I think that's much better than either of them. Yeah.
So what's your reasoning?
For one thing, it's much earlier.
Right.
But I just thought it was more perceptive.
Right.
I mean, first of all, I didn't think that 1984 was one of Orwell's best works. To tell you the truth, I could barely finish it. Right. I thought it was kind of obvious and wooden. You know where it's going. He had some nice comments about Newspeak and this and that, but it was good, useful phrases. But I didn't think it was much of a book. And Huxley's is, it's science fiction, basically.
Right.
But Zamyatin was talking about the real world.
Right.
Russia, of course, so wasn't in the early post-revolutionary period. And he was discussing, I think he sensed what a totalitarian system is like. And it's a projection, but a projection from something real. Orwell had in mind, actually probably had in mind England, and England social democracy, which he thought was going off in a dangerous direction, but it's quite a projection. And anyhow, but I'd suggest reading it and see what you think.
Great.
Frankly, I read it about 60 years ago, so I can't reproduce it, but I know I was impressed by it.
So I guess just a very basic question before I get to some other topical issues is, here I am from LA. I just kind of sent you an email. I'm interested in why you make time for, I don't want to say folks like me, but what it is about your kind of, whether or not it's a philosophy or just kind of who you are, where you're very open to people speaking with you, given your schedule and given other things
it's the
that you could be doing.
Same when I'm not teaching anymore, but it was the same when I was teaching. I taught my work, professional linguistics classes, grad courses, but I also always taught undergraduate courses on my own time, on the kinds of things I write about, social, political issues, and the students who took them couldn't really get credit for a program. These courses weren't admitted into any program, so they were taking it on their own. I often taught them in the evenings, and they just opened to the community. Right. And a lot of people would come year after year because we'd always talk about new things. Right. But I think that's part of one's, I wouldn't even say responsibility. That makes it sound too august. Right. It's a normal, like, why do you talk to your children? Well, okay, it's not that it's responsible.
But you only have 2 children. What if you only have 2 children?
If you only have 2?
I
have 3, so, but a lot of grandchildren. But I'll talk to them. They'll occasionally ask me a question, but then they'll usually say something like, just the 5-minute lecture, please. Like, don't go off,
Right.
And, but I mean, like I say, responsibility is too fancy a word. It's just, you're part of the human race. You have something you think you can talk to people about that might be worthwhile, so you do it. Why do I run around giving talks all the time? Same thing. It'd be more convenient just to sit at home and work.
What teacher has made the biggest impact on you?
Well, I had a very unconventional education. For the first, till I was about 12, my parents were Hebrew teachers, so they worked in the afternoons, teaching. And so they sent me to an experimental, kind of a Deweyite school run by Temple University, and I was there from 2 years old till high school. And that wasn't quite what you're describing, but it was a pretty open school that fostered creativity, independence. He didn't take he took tests, but didn't mean much. Like, just to give you an example, I didn't know I was a good student until I got to high school, literally. I mean, I knew I had skipped a year, but all that meant was I was the smallest kid in the class. Nobody paid any attention to it. When I got to high school, all of a sudden I discovered you're supposed to be first in your class, and you have to pass all the exams. But we never had anything like that. You just did work you were interested in. You worked with other people. I mean, there was a curriculum, normal curriculum, but it was guided, But so the teachers from there I remember actually. Right. But after that, there was one professor at the university, a couple of people at the university. Zelig Harris, I don't know if you know him, who was a very kind of charismatic person. Actually, my contacts with him were political. I mean, theoretically, I was in his department. Right. God, I didn't take many courses. And I was just about to drop out of college when I met him because it was so boring. But he suggested I take his grad courses, and I then started taking other graduate courses, and I came in contact with intellectually very interesting people.
But what qualities did he have as a teacher that you really responded to?
He wasn't a teacher, like our classes would be. There were a couple of students that kind of were close to him, maybe half a dozen. We'd meet in his apartment or his apartment in New York. This is Philadelphia, and talk about politics, science, all kind of things. And he was he was a kind of an intellectual leader. He had a lot of interesting ideas, and people were interested, but it wasn't classes.
Right.
And I took classes with people like Nelson Goodman, a very fine philosopher, but he just discussed his own work, and we thought about it, and we argued about it, and discussed it, and went off on our own and stuff. Actually, I was taking graduate math classes. I'd never had undergraduate math, but there was one professor who I thought was fantastic. He did it just the right way. It was advanced real numbers or something, I forget what it was. Right. He'd come into class and the blackboard, clear the blackboard and write down something, and he'd look at it kind of puzzled, and he'd say, well, let's figure out if that's a theorem. And then the class we'd read stuff and studied stuff, and the ideas would come up, and sometimes they were good ones, sometimes they weren't. He'd kind of steer the discussion, and by the end of the class, we'd have either proven the theorem or disproven it. Yeah. Okay, you learned something that way. But, and I thought it was a terrific way to teach.
Now hold on, Miss Fox. It's all very well to teach my boy to paint pretty pictures and build birdhouses. But he doesn't even know his multiplication tables.
For generations, U.S. youngsters went to school because they had to. And most communities boasted but one room and a single teacher with which to educate their entire and assorted progeny.
Good morning, children. Good morning, teacher. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want.
Happiest moment for the school children of that sterner era was when school let out. But for some youngsters, staying after school seemed almost unavoidable. Yesterday found only in a half dozen advanced experimental schools. Today, in tens of thousands of public schools from Santa Monica, California to Bronxville, New York, progressive education is in force. Learning by doing, learning about practical everyday problems, that knowledge gained during an actual experience is best understood and longest retained.
Reading Dewey, because our school, I think, in name is a Deweyite school, although in practice, not always. And in experience and education, he links education with experience and memory. So does it surprise you that you recall so much more from your educational experiences that involved experience, and you didn't?
No, because it was exciting and you were doing things you were interested in. I mean, look, every one of us knows if we got through college, you can take a course and you're not interested in it, and you have to pass an exam, you don't care one way or another, and you memorize what you have to memorize, and you get an A in the exam, and a week later you can't even remember what the course was about.
Right.
In fact, there's an image in the Enlightenment. There's two competing images during the Enlightenment about education. One of them is education is like pouring water into a vessel, which happens to be a very leaky vessel. Right. That's the take exam and forget what it was case. The other is comes actually from the guy who was the founder of the modern higher education system, Wilhelm von Humboldt, great humanist. He said education is like laying out a string along which the student progresses, and students progress in their own ways. But you've got the string. In other words, there's a structure to what the student is being introduced into. It's not like any random thing. But then they explore it and create in their own ways. But when you get to a place like MIT, Science University, it's almost second nature. Like the famous physicist here, who's a world-famous physicist, was teaching his freshman courses. He was famous for saying that if students asked him, what are we going to cover this semester, he'd say, it really doesn't matter. It matters what you discover.
And I cannot move any further back, so there's no cheat here. I'm going to release it right from my chin here. You realize, as you have just seen, that the slightest push, and this will be my last lecture. I'm going to close my eyes. I don't want to see it. And I'm going to count down from 3 to 0. 3, 2, 1, 0.
I'm Noam Chomsky. I'm on the faculty at MIT, and I've been getting more and more heavily involved in anti-war activities for the last few years.
When was the first time that you ever expressed dissent in a classroom setting, like in a formal school setting where you didn't just kind of internalize your frustration, you actually said something?
Well, I remember, like in the history courses, in the Latin course, I studied Latin, but in the history course, we were being taught stuff that I thought was off the wall.
And this is in high school?
High school,
right.
Yeah. I mean, in elementary school, you just talk,
right.
But so I said some things, but it was obvious you just couldn't, there was no point, you couldn't, it was like talking to the wall, that you couldn't penetrate too much, so I've never bothered. I did it outside of class. We were all radicals outside of class, but never talked in class.
You mentioned that informal schooling had a huge impact on you, and this is both your experiences in New York, visiting these bookstores as a youngster. This is kind of the accidental nature of your own career. Do educators undervalue the importance of informal schooling, or maybe overvalue traditional schooling?
I think that, at least, in my own experience, not just personal experience, I was a Hebrew teacher too, teaching 10-year-old, 12-year-old kids, and we taught the same way. It was a Deweyite framework, so the way to teach the kids was to get them interested in something.
Teaching middle school Hebrew school is one of the most challenging.
It is, because for one thing, the kids don't want to come in the afternoon, they'd rather be playing somewhere. And middle school's a difficult age anyway, but it worked, Most of the kids got interested and studied, had initiative, pursued things on their own, but you had to set things up so they'd get interested in it. Like often this class would start with games.
These are games that you would create?
Yeah, or that were part of the kind of educational program. That actually both my mother and father, who kind of ran the school systems, were Deweyite, deeply committed Deweyite educators, so they had all kind of suggestions and frameworks as to how to pursue, and then we did our own way. But games that involved learning, they did involve learning language or learning customs or learning something else, but in the form of something that kids wanted to solve, and puzzles and so on. So, and they get interested in something, and you go on. And you can do it at any level. So, for example, my sister-in-law was a 6th grade teacher. Chomsky once described, very good teacher actually, very successful. She told me how she taught a class on the American Revolution. A couple of weeks before the class was going to be on this topic, she started just doing things that were arbitrary and annoying, like compelling the kids to do things they didn't want to do and that didn't make any sense. And it got worse and worse, and the kids got upset, and, kind of protesting. And finally, when it got to the point where they were going to be an uprising in the classroom, she turned to the American Revolution, and they were all ready for it. They'd figured out what it's about.
Right.
Okay, that's something that kids will remember, I think.
While it's true that our genetic program rigidly constrains us, I think the more important point is that the existence of that rigid constraint is what provides the basis for our freedom and creativity. And the reason...
What you mean, it's only because we're pre-programmed that we can do all the things we can do.
Exactly. The point is that if we really were plastic organisms without an extensive pre-programming, then the state that our mind achieves would in fact be a reflection of the environment, which means it would be extraordinarily impoverished. Fortunately for us, we're rigidly pre-programmed with extremely rich systems that are part of our biological endowment.
I want to just ask you about structure and creativity. So what I found most interesting about your work on language is that you correlated, creativity and the kind of infinite potential of language, with the fact that it's restricted. And I think you said it's precisely those characteristics of language that make it an effective instrument for free thought and expression seem to have their origins in this innately determined structure. So I'm just wondering what this apparent paradox, structure promoting creativity, suggests about the nature of creative thought, because it's normally associated, maybe that's a misperception, with an absence of structure. I mean, that's what creativity is. So, and how does that reflect itself in the classroom?
That's true, that's commonly thought, but it can't possibly be true. I mean, it's like, take, say, the growth of an organism, say an amoeba or a human being. A human being has a lot of complex capacities and characteristics, even a complex internal structure, like the way your digestive system works and so on. And it can do a lot of things. But that's because we're designed within a framework that allows certain options and blocks others. Suppose that the genetic endowment said, become anything. Okay, so arbitrarily, you'd end up some lump of something or other with no capacities and no ability to do anything. It's the same with the arts. So this was understood in classical aesthetics. So if you read the aesthetic theories of the 17th, 18th century, they understood that creativity presupposes a set of rules, forms and rules. If you can challenge the rules, and it can be one form of creativity is challenging the rules. If you have no structure and no rules at all, it's like tossing paint at the wall.
Right.
It's not a creative act.
Right. This is the value of dissonance.
Well, there's got to be some structure that provides you with capacities. Right. If you don't have internal structure, this is for growth and development, but the same for, say, creative activity is.
So what kind of structures support creativity and what kind of structures inhibit creativity? Structures
that support it are, take, say, writing a sonnet. There are rules for a sonnet. Okay, that framework of rules enables people to do really creative work. You read classical sonnets. If you had no rules at all, then I could write poetry. I can't. And the structure that's there has to be, or take, say, a painting. Here too, it's been studied in the history of art by Meyer Shapiro and others. A painting is in a frame. Well, that alone imposes structure. Right. It's on a flat surface. Okay, that requires you to invent perspective. And a long time before people understood it and how to make it look like a gown is flowing. And all. Okay, that frame itself, just that simple, even that simple frame already sets the conditions under which you can carry out creative acts.
In the loneliness of my life, my father dead, my brother dead, my mother far away, my sister and my wife far away. Nothing here but my own tragic hands that once were guarded by a world, a sweet attention, that now are left.
Let's take like Jack Kerouac on the road. That's somehow less creative than like a Faulkner, because he had no rules. He was just emoting.
He might thought he had no rules, but if you look, he did. It's pretty structured, and otherwise it's just been random sentences coming out. And it was nothing like that.
It's hard to follow the book anyway.
Well, I don't think it's random. Serious. It's not free association.
Right.
And if it was, it would be of no interest.
Right.
You know? And there's development and plot and so on. I mean, even concepts like plot and development are an aesthetic framework.
Right.
You don't want the framework to be so rigid that you always do the same thing, like a detective story where Perry Mason stories, everyone's the same as the last one. You don't want that, but a framework which is rigid enough to make it possible to carry out creative acts, but doesn't inhibit the creative acts.
So that would be kind of like your elementary school experience, which is teachers that present information that might be worthwhile evaluating and allowing kids to independently.
Yeah, or it's like this laying out the string model of education.
Right.
There's got to be something. There's got to be something there to work with, and what's there should be challenging enough so you want to see what you can discover within that framework, and then raise questions about the framework.
So I didn't intend to bring this up, but if you take a look at the AP system in high school, which is, I think it actually started in the Cold War as a way to kind of democratize education and give kind of inner city students a chance to have this kind of high-end education, or this elite education. But here, we take the brightest students in many ways, but provide them the kind of narrowest of educational experiences. And so, but at the same time, this is what is considered appropriate to enter science and
well, take science. If there's an interesting series of editorials you might want to take a look at in about a year ago in Science magazine, the Journal of the American Association for Advancement of Science, the main science journal. The editor, Bruce Alberts, has a series of editorials on science teaching, which are very well done. He's talking about California, incidentally. He's talking about how he testified before the California Education Commission and on science education, and every proposal of his was turned down. But he describes the teaching of science from kindergarten to graduate school as deadening any child's interest in science. So when you can memorize the periodic table, okay, you memorized it, and so what? Why should I bother with a periodic table? You can memorize the enzymes that do so and so. Okay, I memorized them and finished. That's he described the way people study great moments, like the discovery of DNA, but they study it as it was after it's finished. So okay, here's the answer. You lose all the sense of, and then he gives suggestions as to how you ought to teach it, and the suggestions are pretty interesting. So, like, I remember he talks about a kindergarten program which he approved of, thought it was very good. And the way it worked was, these are 5-year-old kids. Each child in the class was given a dish which had on it, in it, a bunch of objects, shells, pebbles, seeds, other things. And then they had a task, figure out which ones are the seeds. So the first thing they did was have what they called a scientific conference. The kids got together and talked and figured out ways in which they could tell what was a seed, and some bad ideas, some good ideas, and of course guidance, and pretty soon they got to experiments that they could carry out to determine which ones are seeds, and finally at the end they figured out which ones were seeds. At that point, each kid was given a magnifying glass, and the teacher cut the seed and opened it up, and they looked in and they found the embryo, and they saw what made it grow. These kids learned something.
Look, like some of our top students are the ones least able to to take their knowledge and apply it in new situations. And actually they frequently like laugh at themselves. They call themselves lab rats, because whenever we present something that didn't show up the day before, either in class or wasn't spelled out in the form of instruction, they have a ton of anxiety. And I'm wondering, we rank number 17 in the world in education. A recent study say that students in Latvia, Chile, and Brazil are making gains in academics 3 times faster than American students. We're 25th in math, but our per pupil spending and the amount of money people spend on college counseling and everything that's surrounding kind of, the test-taking culture, we're number 1. Is that because the way we're educating kids? And these exams, I think, actually are better reflections of what kids know than the SATs. I think it's called the PISA exam.
Well, that whole teaching to test business is disastrous. Right. Like, for example, in our admissions here, we have pretty high admission. You have to have high admission standards in a place like that, because the number of applicants, all of whom are pretty advanced, is way beyond the number you can take.
Right.
But we almost never paid attention to the graduate, the SAT type things, or even to grades.
Sure.
If a kid comes along and got all A's, he's probably too boring to bother with.
If we ask a middle school English teacher, 7th or 8th grade, or maybe a 9th grade world literature teacher, that we feel it's her responsibility, but say she embraces her responsibility of taking students with a various level of literacy. So you have a kid who doesn't speak English very well at all, and a kid who's ready to read, Faulkner or James Joyce. But we think, students learn best when they're exposed to various learning styles, and it's her responsibility to promote democracy in the classroom. So I'm wondering whether or not, and I don't mean this as like an extreme hypothetical, whether, MIT professor who teaches, let's say, molecular physics should also be responsible for teaching kids who haven't taken, say, basic pre-calculus, or whether or not at that level it's already selected out and the kids that are in that class.
By the time you're at MIT, it's pre-selected.
Right.
But you have another life. There are people, and I think it's a good thing, who give talks in high schools or classes in high schools, inner city schools. And in fact, this same famous physicist who I mentioned before, he also wrote books for lay people, introducing physics to people who really had no background in physics, and did it very beautifully.
Right.
And that's another kind of, you can't do it inside a place like MIT because the pre-selection's too high. But you have, you're a human being. You have other things you can do with your life.
But do you think tracking and leveling in high school at any point is necessary? Or should classes always be this very broad, democratic
I think there can be a mix. For example, in a high school, there could be a group of students who happen to have a passionate interest in mathematics. Mm-hmm. Okay, they should have a right to be able to be in a class which is really pushing interesting questions in mathematics that other students aren't interested in. That nothing wrong with that. What shouldn't be done is what I could see with my own children. We were in a mostly professional suburb with so-called good schools and so on. By the time my kids were in 3rd grade, they were ranking the other kids in the class as smart and dumb. The smart ones were being